All right. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, we talk about Ahab and Manasseh being the most evil kings there are.
Right.
But both of them humbled themselves before God before their death. Why don't we ever use that as a good example?
Yeah, if you didn't hear what Miss Judy said, we talked about Ahab and Manasseh and being the most awful kings. And really Manasseh, I think, is interesting because he's plopped right in the middle of Hezekiah and Josiah, right? And so she mentioned, though, that they both sort of humble themselves at the end, and we don't talk about that. And I don't know the answer to that. I know that the things they did were so evil, and that's sort of the way they were remembered. But I think it is a reminder that every person eventually will humble themselves. But yeah, that's a good point. We never point that out in the narratives, and we'll look at that in just a minute as we get ready to go to it. Just a note here before we get to this story in 2 Kings 2. So if you remember when we watched the video, I don't know, 2 or 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, however long it was, there was a comparison made between Elijah and Elisha. And it was said that Elisha asked for a double portion of Elijah's strength and power and such. And so we read 7 miracles of Elijah, and when we get through 2 Kings, we're going to read 14 miraculous acts of Elisha. And so just sort of notes, of course, we know that numbers in the Bible and those things are important and that they're symbolic and poetic. And so just sort of be aware of that. And that might be a good class in itself, the miracles of Elijah and Elisha. So as we go through here in 2 Kings chapter 2, what's one of the things that we know is significant about Elijah, particularly the end of his life? Yeah, he was taken away. He does not die. There's 2 men in the Old Testament who do not die. Who are those 2 men? Yeah, Enoch and Elijah. I love the story of Enoch, by the way, all the way back in Genesis chapter 5. It says that Enoch walked with God. And he continued to walk with God right into heaven. I love that. I think that's very, very poetic. And here Elijah doesn't die. It says in chapter 2, verse 1 of 2 Kings, when the Lord was about to take Elijah up to heaven in a whirlwind, Elijah and Elisha were on their way to Gilgal, and Elijah said to Elisha, "Stay here. The Lord has sent me to Bethel." And they go through here and they tell the story. And starting in verse 9, this was the verse that I want you to be aware of. When they had crossed, Elijah said to Elisha, "Tell me, what can I do for you before I am taken from you? Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit." Elisha replied. "You have asked me a difficult thing," Elijah said. "Yet if you see me when I am taken from you, it will be yours. Otherwise it will not." And as they were walking along and talking together, suddenly a chariot of fire and horses of fire appeared and separated the 2 of them. And Elijah went up to heaven in a whirlwind. Elisha saw this and cried out, my father, the chariots and horsemen of Israel." And Elisha saw him no more. And he took hold of his garment and tore it in 2. And Elisha then picked up Elijah's cloak that had fallen from him and went back and stood on the bank of the Jordan. He took the cloak that had fallen from Elijah and struck the water with it. "Where now is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" he asked. When he struck the water, it divided to the right and to the left, and he crossed over. And then the company of the prophets from Jericho who were watching said, "The spirit of Elijah is resting on Elisha." And so the power here transitions. And so this is a big defining moment, right? Because in 1st and 2nd Kings, although the book is called 1st and 2nd Kings, the kings are not the stars of the show. It is God through the prophets, right, that make the difference and who really are the central key characters in the narrative. And like I said, we're going through quickly, but I do have to stop and share with you one of my favorite stories in the whole Bible. And it happens here in 2 Kings chapter 2, starting in verse 23. "For all you men who are follically challenged, you will love this story. From there, Elisha went up to Bethel, and as he was walking along the road, some boys came out of the town and jeered at him. 'Get out of here, Baldy,' they said. 'Get out of here, Baldy.' He turned around, looked at them, and called down a curse on them in the name of the Lord. And 2 bears came out of the woods and mauled 42 of the boys." Now, this is a violent story, first off. So let's remember, God takes bald jokes seriously. So the next time you make fun of somebody for being bald, be very, very careful. 2 bears come out and maul 42 people. But the part, this, and I don't know, this shouldn't make me laugh, but it does. This is an awful, terrible, violent thing. And then the next sentence says, and he went on to Mount Carmel, and from there returned to Samaria. Just normal, like it just happens every day, bears mauling a bunch of teenagers, whatever, I don't know. One day I'm going to ask the Lord when I get to heaven why that story was included in the Bible, why it happened. But ever since I read that, I don't make fun of people for being bald anymore. I wish there was a story about gray hair so people quit making fun of me about it, but there's not one in there.
Jeremy?
Yes, ma'am.
Don't you think it's more about being respectful to other people than what's on your head?
Certainly, yeah. If there's ever been a warning in the Bible to not bully, maybe we ought to use that in the bullying advertisements, right? That a bear could come out of the woods and maul you when you pick on other people, right? So let's look at the worksheet really quickly. I wanted to start there and look at the transition, but I don't know if you call it a worksheet, chart, whatever you want to call it. But we're looking at the kings here of Israel and Judah. So the top, of course, are the kings of Israel, and so you've got the names there of the kings, the dates of their reigns, and of course these are going to overlap some. The relation to their predecessors, so these are sometimes children, they're sometimes military leaders, brothers, whatever it might be. We get their manner of death, and we get the place of their narrative in the Bible. So this is an awesome reference to go back and be able to keep up, with all the different people and see who does what and try to keep the names straight. There's some key kings as we look at the top part. Jeroboam, of course, he and Rehoboam are the ones that divide the kingdom totally. And then when you go down and look at Ahab there, of course, Ahab is important. He is wounded in battle and dies in 1 Kings 22. Jehu there is arguably one of the most violent characters in all of the Bible. His violent acts just lead to so much destruction, and they really never come back from the actions of Jehu. And he's a really tough, kind of dastardly guy. And you can see on down the line those kings. And then, of course, when you get down to the end, the line ends because they are taken away by the Assyrians. And so just kind of be mindful of that. And that happens in 2 Kings 15. And we're going to try to get to that this morning. If not, we'll do it next week. So those are the kings of Israel. And, of course, you see their manner of death. God strikes down Jeroboam. Nadab is murdered. Elah is murdered. Zimri commits suicide. Jehoram is murdered, of course. We see two more murders down there of Zechariah on down. These last kings are murdered. And so you look on down the line and you think, man, this is, murder, stricken by God, murder. This is a rough, very violent time, right? I mean, if you were to look and see a country that had this history, you'd say, man, how awful and brutal. But this was the kingdom of Israel. And if you remember, the kingdom of Israel split off. Jeroboam goes and breaks off the kingdom. He goes and builds two palaces, two temples, if you will. Do you remember where he builds those temples? What's going to be the capital of Israel? Samaria. Yeah, he builds those temples. He puts in golden calves and idol worship, and so just sort of spirals on out of control. But down in the southern kingdom, it's not much better, really, right? So you look and you see here Rehoboam, who splits the kingdom, and on down. Asa and Jehoshaphat are mentioned as good kings, and so they do some good things. I always thought this is kind of funny. I've known probably 5 or 6 people in my life named Asa. It's a strong, powerful biblical name. I have yet to meet a Jehoshaphat. Anybody know any Jehoshaphat's? I don't know. For whatever reason, we don't like that name in English. But so you see, they all die, and then we've got a string of bad kings. We get a good king again with Joash and Amaziah and Azariah. And so there are some notes by there, but I cannot read what those things mean. Oh, those are alternate names for the kings. Okay. So, of course, you've got another good king in Jotham, and then Hezekiah and Josiah are arguably the two best kings of Judah. And we know some of the events of their lives, particularly Josiah, to me, is an inspirational king. He goes and finds the scroll, and he decides to reinstitute some of the worship. He gets rid of idol worship, and he falls short in some things dealing with the high places, but he's remembered as a good king. And he reigns as king for 31 years. Hezekiah reigns for 29 years. And then, of course, we get on down to Jehoiakim and Jehoiakim and Zedekiah, and that's when the Babylonians are going to take them over at the end of 2 Kings. And so Miss Judy mentioned the two arguably most evil kings, and so those are Ahab and Manasseh. So let's look at those two just really quickly. If we're going to look at some of the good kings, it's worth looking at the bad ones as well. So let's look at the narrative over in 1 Kings chapter 22. 1 Kings 22. I'll sort of tell you, this class, when I originally had the idea in my mind, it was going to be a very, very structured class. When we did this the first few weeks, we had PowerPoints and bullet outlines, but to me, and this is me, and it may be hard for you to follow, I don't know, but just being able to go through and look at the stories and talk about them, and if we want to chase a rabbit, to me, that's a lot more fun. And I know it's probably harder for you to follow, but we'll try to maybe get back to a little more structure. But I like being able to go back and forth and look at these things and maybe draw some meaning out of them. And then it's really good for sermon ideas too, to think about, man, we need to go back and look at this story, or we need to go back and look at this story. And so here we've got the story of Ahab, and we'll start in verse 29 of 1 Kings 22. So the king of Israel and Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, went up to Ramoth Gilead. The king of Israel said to Jehoshaphat, I will enter the battle in disguise, but you wear your royal robe. So the king of Israel disguised himself and went into battle. And the king of Aram had ordered his 32 chariot commanders, do not fight with anyone, small or great, except for the king of Israel. And the chariot commanders saw Jehoshaphat. They thought, surely this is the king of Israel. And so it goes and talks about the battle. It said, but someone drew his bow at random and hit the king of Israel between the sections of his armor. And the king told his chariot driver, wheel around and get me out of the fighting. I've been wounded. All day long the battle raged, and the king was propped up in his chariot facing the Arameans. The blood from his wound ran down onto the floor of the chariot, and that evening he died. And so the king died, verse 37, and was brought to Samaria, and they buried him there. They washed the chariot at a pool in Samaria where the prostitutes bathed, and dogs licked up his blood as the word of the Lord had declared. And as for the other events in Ahab's reign, including all he did, the place he built and adorned with ivory, and the cities he fortified, are they not written in the book of the annals of the king of Israel? And Ahab rested with his ancestors, and Ahaziah, his son, succeeded him as king. So, the end of his life is telling. Remember the prophecy that the dogs would lick up his blood? Well, that's what happens to him. And it even says that they washed his chariot in the same pool where the prostitutes bathed. And so for whatever reason, he's not remembered fondly. But if you go back to chapter 21 and verse 27, it says, when Ahab heard these words, the prophecy about his life and his family, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and fasted. He lay in sackcloth and went around meekly. And the word of the Lord came to Elijah the Tishbite. Have you noticed how Ahab has humbled himself before me? Because he's humbled himself, I will not bring this disaster in his day, but I will bring it on his house in the days of his son. So he was not free of the consequences, but God did relent in not having to let him see that. And so God does show him a little bit of mercy. But I think one of the themes of all these books, and it's a 3-word phrase, and I think about this every time I think about all these things, is the phrase, too far gone. Israel was too far gone. There was no chance of them coming back. So God allowed them to be conquered by the Assyrians. For Judah, even with guys like Hezekiah and Josiah, that phrase, they were too far gone. The things that Manasseh did and some of the idol worship that happened. Manasseh, who we're going to talk about here in a minute, he actually brings idol worship into the temple at Jerusalem. I mean, just, the thing you cannot do. He makes child sacrifice a part of the worship to God. And so that they were just too far gone. And so God allowed them to be conquered by the Babylonians. And so, in one respect, when you think about that, even though that God does relent, and even though Ahab humbles himself at the last minute, that he's too far gone because of the things that he's done. I think that makes me think of two things. It makes me think, now can a nation be so far gone that there's no redeeming the nation? Secondly, it makes me thankful for the blood of Jesus, because that's the only thing, folks, that keeps us from being too far gone. The things that we do in our lives, there's only one thing. The Bible says the blood of bulls and goats was not sufficient to save us from our sins. The blood of Christ that keeps us from ever getting to that point that we're too far gone. So just sort of have that in mind as you think about some of these characters. But the prophecy about Ahab is fulfilled there. Yes, ma'am.
Does that mean that he was not forgiven, Ahaz?
Ahab? No, I don't think so. I don't think he was. But I mean, that's
He humbled
my
himself,
opinion.
but he was too far gone?
Yeah.
Is that what-
That's my opinion, yes. But thankfully, I'm not judge in those things. So, but yes. Let's look at the story really quickly of Manasseh over in 2 Kings chapter 21. 2 Kings 21. Do we remember much about Hezekiah, by the way, and we're going to talk about him a little. Do we remember Hezekiah's great triumph and who he was standing up against? This is following the Assyrian invasion, right? And he stands up to the Assyrians, and they're under a very famous biblical king. Do you remember who it is, in the king of Assyria? We actually have a modern archaeological piece that talks about this king, and it's a round prism. Sennacherib, yes, Sennacherib. We have Sennacherib's prism as a modern artifact where we can know a little bit more about him. But yeah, Sennacherib, and so Hezekiah stands up to him, and one of the great stories of standing up against evil and standing up against foreign kings, and it's Hezekiah that's responsible for the downfall of Sennacherib. But after Hezekiah, we get to Manasseh. Manasseh was 12 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 55 years. He did evil, of course, in the sight of the Lord. He rebuilt the high places, it says in verse 3. He erected altars to Baal and made an Asherah pole, just like Ahab had done. Bowed down to all the starry hosts and worshiped them, built altars in the temple of the Lord. And then verse 6 is the one where we talk about too far gone. This is the one where it seems like God drew the line. He sacrificed his own son in the fire. Sacrificed his own son in the fire of the temple of the Lord. Practiced divination, sought omens, consulted mediums and spiritists. He did much evil in the eyes of the Lord, arousing his anger. And so Manasseh here is, I don't know another way to say this. To me, he's much more evil than Ahab. Because Ahab, we expect him to be evil. He is part of the rebellious kingdom. He's a trickster and a swindler, and he married an evil woman. But Manasseh here, you expect more from. Manasseh is the son of Hezekiah, and although he's only 12 when his dad dies, you expect him to follow the examples, to restore proper worship, to continue to follow in that path. But instead, all he does is the complete opposite. He's evil. He builds idols to all these false gods. He just does nothing but evil, and then he brings these altars into the temple and sacrifices children including his own son, there in God's house. And so God will not allow this. He does allow him to reign, but he's going to face the consequences. Let's jump down to verse 13. He says, I will stretch out over Jerusalem the measuring line used against Samaria and the plumb line used against the house of Ahab. I will wipe out Jerusalem as one wipes a dish, wiping it and turning it upside down. I will forsake the remnant of my inheritance and give them into the hands of enemies. They will be looted and plundered by all their enemies. They have done evil in my eyes and have aroused my anger from the day their ancestors came out of Egypt until this day. It says, moreover, Manasseh also shed so much innocent blood that he filled Jerusalem from end to end, besides the sin that he had caused Judah to commit, so that they did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And as for the other events of Manasseh's reign, all he did, including the sin he committed, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Judah? And Manasseh rested with his ancestors and was buried in his palace garden, the garden of Uzzah, and Amon succeeded him as king. And so this is the line where I believe God decides that he's going to give the kingdom to the hands of the Babylonians. And it's not just the actions of Manasseh, right? He says, from the time they left Egypt until now, there has been nothing but rebellion. And he says, I'm going to wash my hands of it the same way that I did with Samaria. And so a big point there. And you get over to chapter 22 with Josiah. That he's 8 years old when he becomes king. He finds the scroll, and but they're just too far gone. They're just too far gone in their actions. All right, so here's what we're going to do. That clock is a little slow. Next week, when we come together, we're going to maybe look really quickly in a little more detail at Hezekiah and Josiah, and then we're going to look at the end of 2 Kings, which to me is one of the saddest pieces of scripture in all of the Bible. It is the story of God's temple being looted and plundered, as he prophesied here. It is the story of God's people being taken away into captivity. It is the end of everything that God had. So we start in 1 Kings, right, with the glory of the temple, and then we get to the end of 2 Kings with the emptying and destruction of the temple. And so just in this time period of these two books, which I know covers a lot of time, but it's actually only one book in the Hebrew Bible, we get the glory of the temple to the destruction of the temple, and everything in between is just sort of leading to those big points of climax in the books. And so we will look at that. We're not going to spend a ton of time on 1st and 2nd Chronicles, only because it is the retelling of the events of the earlier things. But we are going to spend probably one session looking at how it's a different viewpoint. And so we'll compare and contrast the stories of Samuel and Kings with the stories of the chronicler. And then we're going to get into one of my favorite parts of Scripture, which is the narrative of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. And then we'll spend some time on the prophets. When we get to the prophets, you guys are going to have to help me. We're going to stick to one class per prophet, because if you have to listen to 3 weeks on Obadiah, you'll probably be tired of me by then. So we'll do that. We'll try to adhere to that, and then we'll jump in to the New Testament in just a little while. To me, this class is fun. It's a nice refresher to me, things you learn in school and things you learned as a kid, and you go back and you revisit the narratives. We don't preach a lot of sermons about Ahab and Sennacherib and all these characters, but there's a ton of meaning in there and a ton of things we can draw out. And so I hope that you're enjoying this as much as I am. Questions, comments before we take a break?
Jeremy,
Yes, sir.
these kings that became rulers at such a young age, what's the chances they made these decisions?
Very, very slim. Yeah.
So who influenced them?
So if you didn't hear what Keith said, he said, who's making the decisions for these 12-year-old kings and 8-year-old kings? Their mothers. Listen, if you've ever lived in a house with a woman, you know the answer to that question. Their mothers, advisors, people who were put in positions to help them make decisions until they reached manhood. Now, by the way, we know that you reach the age of manhood at a much younger age. By 15 years old, they're already making all these decisions. But yeah, that's a great question, a great point. Teresa, do you have your hand up?
I've been listening to the Books of Kings audio because it's
Yes.
for me. And the thing that occurred to me this morning when I woke up was, at the end of every one of these kings you hear, so-and-so did blah, 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 he was good in the sight of the Lord, or he did bad in the sight of the Lord, and yet the high places remained.
Yeah.
They did not take down the high places. The high places were pagan worship at the time, but it just crossed my mind, what are our high places?
Mhm.
We have high places in this nation, in our individual lives. What is my high place that I am still tending while I worship my God?
Yeah. And that sounds like a great sermon idea right there.
Still
But
hanging on to it.
yeah, if you didn't hear what was said, she said, all these kings, whether they did good or bad, it says that they still kept the high places. And even they would tear them down and rebuild them, right? Because even though they were trying to serve God, they still had those places. And so they were trying to straddle the fence between the worship of these false pagan gods and the worship of the one true God. And listen, that's what we spent these Wednesday nights talking about the last few weeks, about this idol worship. We're actually going to talk about this morning with the story of Herod Agrippa the First, that if we don't completely and totally tear down whatever we have made an idol, then it's going to follow us and be to our detriment. That's a fantastic point. All right, that's a great point to stop. We're going to take a break, and we'll meet back here in about 15 minutes for worship.